What if the oldest stories we tell are not imagination, but memory? Across every continent, separated by oceans and millennia, cultures describe the same event. A great flood, a divine warning, and mysterious teachers who saved a remnant of humanity. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, the Hebrews called them Watchers, the Andeans called them Viracocha, and in each telling, these beings appeared before catastrophe, taught forbidden knowledge, and then vanished as the waters rose. Welcome to Whispered Empires, where we explore the shadows between history and myth. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest or wonder, like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. Tonight, we ask a question carved in stone and whispered through ages. Did they watch the stars and know? There is a story humanity cannot stop telling. It surfaces in Mesopotamia, carved into clay before empires rose. It echoes in Hebrew scrolls hidden in desert caves. It appears in Greek myth, in Hindu Purana, in the oral traditions of peoples who never met, never traded, never shared a single word. The pattern is too precise to dismiss. A world drowns. A chosen few are warned. Teachers descend from mountains or stars, bearing knowledge the masses were never meant to hold. And when the waters recede, civilization begins again, haunted by memory of what came before. Scholars call it coincidence, the human mind seeking order in chaos. But the details trouble that explanation. Why do cultures who never touched describe teachers with the same gifts? Star knowledge, agriculture, writing, the working of metal. Why does the flood always come as punishment? And why is the warning always given to one who builds, who saves, who remembers? The Sumerian Ziusudra, the biblical Noah, the Greek Deucalion, they are not copies but echoes. And echoes require a source, a first sound that traveled farther than any empire, deeper than any sea. Let us begin in Mesopotamia, in the mud between two rivers where writing was born. Here, the oldest version sleeps in cuneiform, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago but describing events far older. The Eridu Genesis tells of Enki, god of wisdom and water, who broke divine silence to warn a faithful man. The Council of Gods had decreed annihilation. Humanity had grown too numerous, too loud, perhaps too knowing. But Enki whispered through walls of reeds, teaching Ziusudra to build a vessel, to save the seed of all living things before heaven opened. Move north and forward through centuries. The Hebrews, exiled in Babylon, heard these stories and wove them into their own fabric. Genesis chapter 6 speaks of Noah, but also of something stranger. The Nephilim, giants born when sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives. The text is cryptic, almost embarrassed, as though the scribes inherited a tradition too strange to fully explain. But the books of Enoch, excluded from canon but treasured by early Christians, elaborate. 200 watchers descended on Mount Hermon, and they taught, and they warned, and they transformed everything. Leap across the world to the Andes, where stone cities perch at heights that steal breath. The Aymara people of Tiwanaku speak of Viracocha, a bearded stranger who appeared after a great flood destroyed the previous world. He brought knowledge of agriculture, architecture, astronomy. He taught, he healed, he ordered the sun and moon into their courses, and then he walked across the Pacific and disappeared. The Inca inherited this story, and the Spanish heard it with astonishment, for it echoed their own scriptures. Different mountain, different ocean, same structure. Teacher, catastrophe, warning, renewal. The Maya carved it into stone calendars. The Hopi painted it into kiva walls. The Aboriginal Australians sang it into songlines that map drowned coasts. The pattern holds. There was a world before. It ended in water. Beings who knew descended or survived or both, and they carried forward the seeds, the stories, the star charts that would allow humanity to begin again. Some call these beings gods. Others call them survivors of an even earlier catastrophe, refugees from a drowned Atlantis or Lemuria. But labels matter less than structure. They watched. They warned. They saved what they could. What did they watch? The heavens, certainly, Every ancient culture that left records tracked stars with precision that baffles modern assumptions about primitive peoples. The Sumerians divided the sky into constellations we still use. The Maya calculated Venus cycles to the day over millennia. The builders of Göbekli Tepe aligned pillars to Sirius and the summer solstice. If the Watchers existed, perhaps that is what they were. Astronomer priests who noticed patterns in celestial mechanics, who saw cometary debris, who read in the stars that catastrophe cycles. Perhaps the warning was not supernatural but scientific, whispered by those who calculated doom. Or perhaps the knowledge was older still. Geologists now confirm what myths insist. The world did drown. Between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, as the Ice Age released its grip, seas rose 400 feet. Coastlines where humans thrived for millennia vanished beneath waves. Doggerland, connecting Britain to Europe, drowned. Sundaland, a subcontinent in Southeast Asia, became islands. The Persian Gulf was a river valley, then a bay, then a sea. If sophisticated coastal cultures existed in the Mesolithic, we would never know. Their cities sleep under 300 feet of salt water and 10,000 years of sediment. Did the survivors of that drowning world become the teachers of the next? Did Mesolithic fisherfolk who possessed star knowledge, boat building, agriculture's first experiments, flee inland to mountain refuges and river valleys? Did they arrive among hunter-gatherers as seeming gods, bringing gifts that looked like magic? Seeds that grew food, fire that melted stone into metal, marks that held speech beyond memory? If so, the myth of Watchers and Anunnaki encodes not angels but refugees, not supernatural but intergenerational, the passing of knowledge from a world that drowned to those who would inherit the mud left behind. They watched the stars and knew. That phrase echoes through Enochian text and Sumerian hymn. The Watchers taught the signs of earth, sun, moon, and stars. Enki gave humanity the me, the divine principles that govern civilization. Viracocha ordered the heavens. Across the pattern, astronomical knowledge is the first gift, the foundation of all that follows. Why? Because survival after catastrophe requires calendars, navigation, the ability to predict floods and droughts and seasons. The stars do not change. When everything else drowns, burns, or crumbles, Orion still rises in the east, and the Pleiades still mark the planting season. But there is a shadow in every version. The knowledge was forbidden. The Watchers were punished. Enki defied the divine council. Prometheus was chained to a rock for giving fire to mortals. Why would the gods, if gods they were, object to human enlightenment? Perhaps the story encodes a warning that knowledge without wisdom brings destruction. Perhaps it remembers a technological leap that preceded the flood, a hubris that contributed to catastrophe. Or perhaps the forbidden aspect simply reflects the way knowledge always threatens established order, the way every enlightenment looks like rebellion to those who guard the old ways. The first chapter closes with a question the story will follow through stone and star. Were the Watchers watchers of the sky, reading comet paths and solar cycles? Were they watchers of time, survivors who remembered a previous age and tried to warn the next? Or were they watchers of humanity, elder cousins or visiting strangers who saw potential worth preserving? The pattern is undeniable. The flood is confirmed. The teachers are universal. What remains is interpretation. They watched the stars and knew. Knew what? That is the mystery we will trace through temple, tablet, mountain, and myth. In the beginning there was Eridu, not metaphor but geography, mud and reed and the confluence of waters in southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, who gave the world its first cities, its first laws written down, its first literature that was not hymn or inventory, insisted Eridu was the first city of all. Here, before Uruk rose, before Babylon dreamed of hanging gardens, a temple was raised to Enki, lord of the deep waters and secret wisdom. The ruins still stand, or rather still sink into the marshes, older than any pharaoh, older than any alphabet except the one pressed here into clay. Enki was not the chief god but perhaps the most beloved, patron of magicians and craftsmen. friend to humanity when others in the divine council showed only contempt. The myths paint him as clever trickster and wise teacher both, the one who gave humans the me, those divine principles that separate civilization from chaos. Kingship, priesthood, writing, building, law. But the greatest myth is the flood. The Eridu Genesis, recovered in fragments, tells how the gods wearied of human noise and decided on annihilation. Only Enki objected. Only Enki warned. Defying the council, he whispered instructions through the reed walls of Ziusadra's house. Build a boat, Enki commanded. Bring seed of every living thing. The council meets in secret. They plan your destruction. The text is fragmented, broken across millennia and the spades of looters, but the structure is clear. Ziusadra, described as pious king and sage, builds as instructed. The storms come. 7 days and nights, the tablet says, the flood sweeps over. When the waters subside, Ziusadra makes sacrifice, and the gods, smelling the sweet savor and realizing they have nearly destroyed their food source and worshippers, grant him immortality. He is taken to Dilmun, the paradise island, to live forever. Dilmun appears again and again in Sumerian texts, an island to the east where the sun rises, where there is no sickness, death, or sorrow. Some scholars place it in Bahrain, where ancient civilization did flourish. Others suggest it is pure myth eaten by another name. But the detail that haunts is this: Ziusadra is given eternal life not as reward but as preservation. He becomes a living archive, a memory keeper who holds in his mind the world before the flood. In later Babylonian versions, his name becomes Utnapishtim, and he tells his story to Gilgamesh, passing the memory forward. The Anunnaki, meanwhile, trouble every easy interpretation. In Sumerian texts, they are the great gods, children of the sky. They judge the dead. They decide the fates. But their role is strange. They are not distant and transcendent, but involved, walking among humans, taking human form, interbreeding. Later Babylonian accounts describe them as 7 judges of the underworld. Akkadian cylinder seals show them in council. And always, they possess knowledge that predates humanity. The arts of civilization, the measurement of time, the secrets of metal and grain. Were they gods or priests, archetypes or memories? The text will not clarify. At Eridu, archaeologists have traced 18 building levels, each temple built atop the ruins of the last, going back to the Ubaid period, 6,000 years before the present. The earliest structures are small, almost domestic, yet clearly sacred. Over centuries they grew, as though the importance of the site was realized rather than imposed. Why here? The location is not strategically defensible. It sits in marshland prone to flooding. Perhaps that is precisely the point. Eridu remembered the flood. It built its first temple to the god who warned, the one who saved. Memory precedes monument. Faith begins in gratitude for survival. The cuneiform tablets recovered from Eridu and nearby Ur contain more than myth. They record astronomy. The rising of Venus, the path of Mars, lunar eclipses predicted with accuracy that suggests centuries of observation. They record mathematics, the sexagesimal system we still use for time and angles. They record medicine, law, agriculture, trade. All of this, the Sumerians insisted, was taught by the Anunnaki before the flood and preserved by the survivors after. Is that simply how cultures explain their own genius, projecting innovation onto gods? Or were the gods a way to say our ancestors knew more than we remember? Then there is the question of timing. The Sumerian king list, another text that defies easy dismissal, divides history into 2 eras, before the flood and after. Before, it claims kings reigned for impossible spans, tens of thousands of years. After, the numbers become plausible. Scholars dismiss the early numbers as mythic, symbolic. But what if the text encodes something real in symbolic language? What if before the flood refers not to individual reigns but to cultural memory of a longer, slower age, the Mesolithic, when human society existed but left little trace? What if the flood marks the transition we recognize, the sudden arrival of complex civilization? Enki's symbol was the goat fish, a creature of two worlds, land and sea. It appears on cylinder seals swimming through the waters of the Abzu, the primordial deep from which Enki drew wisdom. Some see in this only mythology, the sort of hybrid creature every ancient culture invented. But others note that coastal adaptation, living between shore and water, defined the Mesolithic peoples who thrived before the Great Drowning. The goat fish swims through both realms. Enki knows both worlds, the one that drowned and the one built on its mud. Perhaps he is not God but memory, the persistence of coastal wisdom in the river valley. At the mouth of the Euphrates, where Eridu's pilgrims once traveled to the sea, the coastline has changed dramatically since ancient times. Sedimentation, tectonics, sea level fluctuation, they have all rewritten geography. The Persian Gulf was once smaller, perhaps even a freshwater lake in earlier ages. Sumerian myth speaks of Enki's journey from Dilmun, arriving by water to bring civilization. What if Dilmun was not mystical but geographical, a coastal culture that did exist on islands now submerged? What if the wisdom of Eridu came literally across water, carried by survivors of a drowned coast seeking higher ground? They watched the stars and knew. The phrase returns. In the temple at Eridu, priests tracked Venus as morning and evening star. They marked the solstices. They understood that heaven moved in cycles. If catastrophe came from the sky, cometary impact, or solar outburst, watchers of the stars might have seen it coming. If catastrophe came from the earth, meltwater pulses and rising seas, watchers of the coast would have witnessed it first. Either way, the warning would come from those who observed, who recorded, who remembered patterns. The watchers need not be angels. They could simply be those who paid attention when others looked away. Eridu stands half-drowned in its own marsh, a fitting monument for the city that remembered the flood. Its mud bricks melt back into the mud from which they rose. But the tablets survive, baked hard by time or fire, the words pressed into them still readable after 5,000 years. Build a boat. Save the seed. Remember. The instruction passes from Enki to Ziusadra, from Ziusadra to his sons, from Sumer to Babylon to the Hebrews in exile, from ancient scribes to modern archaeologists who kneel in the mud and carefully brush dirt from broken clay. The warning, it seems, was meant to travel. Not every sacred text made it into the canon. The Book of Enoch, treasured by early Christians, quoted in the New Testament Epistle of Jude, was excluded from most Bibles, deemed too strange, too detailed in its cosmology, too specific in its claims about angels who fell and taught forbidden things. Yet it survived in Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church kept it sacred, and in fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is old, certainly 1st century BCE, possibly much older in its oral roots. And it tells a story the Bible only hints at, the watchers who descended and changed everything. The book opens with Enoch, 7th patriarch before the flood, great-grandfather of Noah, described in Genesis with tantalizing brevity. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. What did that mean? The Book of Enoch elaborates. He was taken into heaven, shown the structure of the cosmos, the paths of sun and moon, the places of punishment and reward. He was given visions of future judgment and past rebellion, and he was told the secret. 200 angels, assigned to watch over humanity, descended to Mount Hermon, saw the beauty of human women, and chose incarnation. Mount Hermon stands at the border of ancient Israel and Syria, a snow-capped peak visible from Damascus and the Sea of Galilee. The name means consecrated or forbidden, and local tradition has always held it as a place where heaven touched earth. The Book of Enoch is specific. The 200 watchers gathered on the summit and swore an oath. They would descend. They would take human wives. They would teach humanity the arts of heaven. Their leader was Samjaza, but the one who taught most was Azazel. They knew they were transgressing. They swore together, binding themselves in mutual guilt. What they taught became the curriculum of civilization. Azazel taught men the art of making swords, knives, shields, breastplates, the metals and their working. He taught cosmetics, the beautifying of eyelids, the use of precious stones and dyes. Samjaza taught enchantments and root cutting, herbalism and medicine. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakil taught astrology. Kokabil taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds and weather signs. These are not arbitrary gifts. They are the foundations of technology, medicine, warfare, astronomy, agriculture. They are, in short, the sudden emergence of complex society from simpler roots. The text treats this as transgression. The consequences were immediate. The watchers took wives. The women bore children. But these were not normal children. The text calls them Nephilim, giants, mighty ones of renown. They grew enormous, consuming the produce of men, then consuming men themselves. They turned against humanity, teaching violence, oppression, witchcraft. They polluted the earth with blood. And when the watchers saw what they had unleashed, it was too late. The four archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, brought complaint before the Most High. Heaven looked at earth and saw only corruption. The decree was issued. Flood. Cleansing. Only Noah's line would survive to begin again. But Enoch was not there to drown. He had already been taken, translated into heavenly places to serve as scribe and mediator. The text describes him advocating for the fallen watchers, carrying their petition to the throne. But the answer was no. They had left their proper dwelling. They had revealed eternal secrets never meant for mortal knowledge. Their punishment would be severe. The watchers would be bound in the valleys of the earth until the final judgment. Their giant offspring would destroy each other, and the flood would erase the surface, leaving only Noah, who was perfect in his generations, unblemished by the hybrid corruption. The historical context matters. The Book of Enoch was written or compiled during the Second Temple period, when Judea chafed under foreign rule, when faithful Jews questioned why God allowed oppression. The Watcher myth offered an explanation. The world was corrupted not by human sin alone, but by cosmic rebellion, by divine beings who broke their boundaries. Evil had supernatural origins. And if the first world required a flood, perhaps the current world required a similar cleansing. The book ends with prophecies of messianic judgment, a new age when the righteous would be vindicated. It is apocalyptic literature, written for people who needed hope that corruption would not last forever. But what if we strip away the apocalyptic framing and look at the skeleton of the story? Beings from elsewhere came to a mountain. They possessed knowledge humans did not have. They taught metalworking, astronomy, writing, agriculture, medicine. They interbred with locals, creating a hybrid culture. This culture became violent and collapsed. A flood followed, whether as divine punishment or natural catastrophe. Survivors preserved the memory, and later generations told it as a moral tale about boundaries and forbidden knowledge. Remove the supernatural language, and what remains could be the folk memory of a real cultural encounter and its aftermath. They watched the stars and knew. The watchers, in this reading, might have been astronomer priests from a coastal culture displaced by rising seas, arriving at highland Mount Hermon with star charts and agricultural techniques that seemed miraculous to Neolithic Highlanders. Or they might have been survivors of an earlier experiment with civilization, refugees from the younger Dryas carrying memories of a more complex world into a simpler one. The interbreeding would be literal. Genetic mixing produces hybrid vigor but also cultural tension. The violence could be the inevitable clash when too much changes too fast, when old ways cannot accommodate new knowledge. Göbekli Tepe offers a parallel. In southern Turkey, around 9600 BCE, hunter-gatherers built a temple complex that should not exist. Massive T-shaped pillars, carved with animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circles. No evidence of agriculture, no permanent settlement, yet organized labor on a scale that suggests either powerful leadership or compelling belief or both. The The site was built right after the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe. Then, centuries later, it was intentionally buried, carefully filled in and abandoned. Did builders encode knowledge in stone because they had seen the world nearly end? Did they bury it as a time capsule or a warning? The Book of Enoch describes Azazel being bound in a rocky desert place until the day of judgment. Semjaza and the other watchers are imprisoned in valleys of the earth. Their knowledge is sealed away but not destroyed. The text preserves the memory that what was taught still exists, hidden but not gone, dangerous but potentially recoverable. Perhaps this too is pattern. Knowledge that destabilizes must be preserved but controlled, written down but sealed, buried but marked. Enoch himself becomes the keeper of dangerous knowledge, the scribe who writes what must not be forgotten but also must not be freely shared. The watchers watched the stars and knew something was coming. They taught because time was short. They broke boundaries because boundaries seemed less important than survival. The flood came, as flood does, whether divine punishment or climate physics. Knowledge survived in fragments carried by Noah, preserved by Enoch, encoded in stones at Göbekli Tepe, whispered in Sumerian temples, written in books that were kept or excluded depending on who feared or treasured their contents. The chapter closes with a question. If the watchers were teachers, what lesson were they trying to impart? And did we learn it, or simply survive to forget again? What, specifically, was worth saving? The myths list gifts: agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy, medicine, writing. These are not random. They are the foundations that separate subsistence from civilization. To grow food is to stay in one place. To track stars is to measure time and navigate. To work metal is to create tools that create other tools. To heal is to preserve life beyond the immediate. To write is to remember beyond the lifespan of memory. Every one of these arts requires patient observation across generations. If the flood marks a break, a reset, then someone had to carry these observations forward, or humanity would have started from scratch. Agriculture did not emerge gradually worldwide. It appeared suddenly, around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, and within 2,000 years had spread or independently emerged in China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, New Guinea, each region domesticating different species but using similar principles. Orthodox archaeology calls this the Neolithic Revolution, driven by climate stability after the Ice Age. But the timing troubles. It begins immediately after the Younger Dryas catastrophe, as though the crisis prompted preservation of food knowledge. And the early domesticates, wheat, barley, rice, maize, show genetic changes that imply deliberate selection over generations. Someone was already experimenting. The flood did not start agriculture. It motivated its preservation. The stars presented a different problem. To know that Sirius rises heliacally before the Nile floods requires watching for generations. To calculate that Venus returns to the same position every 8 years requires centuries of record-keeping. To map the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble that shifts which star marks north, requires millennia. Yet the Sumerians knew this. The Egyptians knew this. The Maya knew this. If civilization truly began from zero after the flood, how did these cultures acquire knowledge that takes longer than civilization to accumulate? Either they inherited records from before the break, or the break was not as complete as myth suggests. Metallurgy adds to the mystery. The progression from native copper to smelted copper to bronze to iron is not intuitive. You do not accidentally discover that heating specific rocks with charcoal at precise temperatures yields metal. Someone had to experiment, fail, persist, remember. Yet copper working appears in Anatolia by 800 BCE, bronze by 3300 BCE. The Vinca culture in Balkans was smelting copper by 5500 BCE, earlier than Sumer. And everywhere it appears, the knowledge seems complete, not fumbling toward discovery but applying understood principles. Were there earlier experiments we have not found? Or was there a source, a teacher culture that spread the technique? Medicine in ancient texts is startlingly sophisticated. The Ebers Papyrus from Egypt lists hundreds of remedies, many verified by modern chemistry. Sumerian tablets describe surgical procedures. Chinese medical texts compiled in antiquity reference traditions going back to mythical emperors. The Book of Enoch specifically states Azazel taught root cutting and herbalism. Indigenous cultures worldwide possess pharmacological knowledge that would take generations of trial and error to accumulate. Which bark relieves pain, which leaf prevents infection, which combination cures rather than kills. This wisdom is universal. Either every culture independently experimented through countless deaths, or core knowledge was transmitted and locally adapted. The latter seems more likely. Writing might be the most important preservation technology. Memory fails. Oral tradition drifts. But marks pressed into clay or carved into stone can wait millennia for a reader. Cuneiform emerged around 3400 BCE, seemingly complete. Egyptian hieroglyphs appeared roughly the same time. Chinese script by 1200 BCE. Each system is complex, with hundreds of signs requiring years to master. Yet they appear suddenly in the archaeological record, not as pictograms slowly becoming abstract but as functional writing systems. The earliest tablets from Uruk are not primitive. They record complex economic transactions, temple inventories, astronomical observations. Whoever invented writing knew exactly what it was for: permanent memory. They watched the stars and knew. The phrase takes on weight when we understand what astronomical knowledge enables. Navigation by stars allows migration, trade, return from far journeys. Calendars based on celestial cycles tell when to plant, when to expect floods, when seasons turn. Precession tracking suggests awareness of deep time, the understanding that the world changes slowly but inevitably. If the watchers taught the stars, they gave not just information but context. You are part of a cosmos that moves in patterns, and those patterns can be known, trusted, used to organize survival. Star knowledge is fundamentally knowledge that order persists despite catastrophe. Göbekli Tepe's pillars may encode such knowledge. Pillar 43, called the Vulture Stone, shows creatures arranged in patterns some researchers interpret as constellations. A scorpion appears where Scorpius would be. Birds where Cygnus rises. The arrangement, they argue, depicts the sky at a specific date, roughly 10,950 BCE, the beginning of the Younger Dryas. If true, the temple was built not as worship but as warning, a star map marking the time catastrophe struck, preserved in stone so future generations would know that heaven and earth are connected, that disaster can come from above, that attention must be paid to what moves in the night sky. But encoded knowledge only matters if someone can read it. This returns us to the necessity of transmission. If Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors who feared forgetting, they needed a system to ensure future generations would understand what was carved in stone. This might explain the sudden appearance of priesthoods, specialized classes whose function was to remember, interpret, and teach. The Sumerian term for temple library was House of Wisdom. Egyptian priests were keepers of mysteries. Druids memorized vast bodies of oral tradition. Every complex society develops a memory class. Perhaps they originated not as religious innovation but as practical necessity. Someone had to remember what the stones meant. Tiwanaku in the Andes sits at nearly 13,000 feet, a breathtaking altitude where pre-industrial civilization should struggle. Yet massive stone structures stand in precise alignment. The gateway of the sun displays a calendar with astronomical precision. Local legend says Viracocha, the teacher, came after a flood and brought the knowledge to build, to farm at altitude, to track stars for planting at the edge of what Earth supports. The Spanish chroniclers recorded these stories and noted how similar they were to their own flood accounts. Different ocean, different mountain, but the same structure. Catastrophe, teacher, knowledge, survival. The pattern repeats because the pattern is true, however one interprets true. Consider the alternative hypothesis. Humanity in the Mesolithic was not primitive, merely coastal, mobile, focused on resources we do not preserve well. Fish, reeds, boats, oral tradition. When seas rose, the sophisticated coasts drowned and only the simpler highlands remained visible to archaeology. The survivors carried their sophistication inland, became teachers to the Stone Age Highlanders, and over generations the memory of origin faded, but the gifts remained. Agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy, medicine, writing, these were not invented after the flood. They were saved through it. The Watchers are the refugees. The Nephilim are the hybrid culture. The violence is the clash. The flood is real. And what we call civilization beginning is actually civilization resuming. The chapter closes by returning to the original question. What was worth saving? Not just biological life, though the ark carries that symbolism. What required preservation was intellectual life, the accumulated observation and experiment of countless generations. Seeds and star charts, metallurgy and medicine, writing systems and astronomical cycles. The knowledge that transforms survival into thriving. Whether taught by angels or carried by refugees or both simultaneously true in different languages, the core claim of every flood myth holds. Someone made sure we did not start from scratch. They watched, they warned, they saved what they could. And because they did, we build cities on the mud of the drowned world. Myth insists the world drowned. Geology confirms it, though the timeline stretches where narrative compresses. Between 18,000 and 8,000 years ago, ice sheets that covered half the northern hemisphere melted. Sea levels rose 400 feet. Coastlines drowned. River valleys became bays. Peninsulas became islands. The process was not gradual everywhere. Meltwater pulse events, when ice dams broke and glacial lakes emptied into oceans, raised seas by meters in decades. To anyone living on a coast, watching water creep inland year by year, generation by generation, it would feel exactly like divine judgment. The flood myths are not invention. They are testimony. The Younger Dryas adds urgency to the timeline. Around 10,800 BCE, as the Ice Age was ending, temperatures suddenly plunged again for over 1,000 years. The rebound, when it came around 9,600 BCE, was catastrophic. Ice melted rapidly. Meltwater pulse 1b sent vast quantities into oceans. Some researchers propose an extraterrestrial impact triggered the cooling, pointing to a layer of platinum and nanodiamonds in sediments worldwide. Whether impact or internal climate dynamics, the effect was the same: whiplash. Cold, then warm, then flood. Any coastal culture thriving before 10,800 BCE would have been devastated. Survivors would remember it as the time the world ended and began again. Doggerland is the poster child for drowned worlds. Between Britain and continental Europe stretched a landscape of hills, rivers, forests. Hunter-gatherers thrived there for thousands of years. Tools, mammoth bones, even a Mesolithic settlement have been dredged from the North Sea floor. By 6500 BCE, it was gone, submerged under rising seas. No written records preserve its memory because writing did not yet exist there. But across the Channel, in Britain, oral traditions speak of lands lost to the sea. Welsh legend describes Cantor Gwaelyd, a kingdom drowned when sea walls failed. Is it memory of Doggerland, passed down 7,000 years? The geology says drowning happened. The myths say people remembered. Sundaland in Southeast Asia tells a larger story. When seas were low, the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines formed a continent twice the size of India. Rivers crossed what is now ocean. Archaeological surveys suggest sophisticated coastal and riverine cultures developed there in the late Pleistocene. As seas rose, this entire region drowned, leaving only highland remnants as islands. Linguists note that Austronesian languages, now spread across the Pacific, originated in this region. Did the drowning of Sundaland trigger the Great Austronesian Expansion? Boat peoples carrying their languages and navigation skills outward because home had vanished? The flood creates diaspora. The diaspora spreads the flood story. The Persian Gulf presents similar evidence. Geologists have mapped a river system, now submerged, that drained the Tigris and Euphrates through a valley where the Gulf is today. Before 8000 BCE, this valley was inhabited, a freshwater system between mountains. Then sea level rise turned valley into bay into gulf. The Sumerians, appearing in the archaeological record around 5400 BCE at the head of this newly formed gulf, told stories of emerging from the sea, of Enki coming from Dilmun to bring civilization. Is Dilmun the drowned valley, and are the Sumerians its displaced population, moving upstream as water rose? The timing aligns. Geography confirms. Myth preserves. Aboriginal Australians hold the longest continuous oral traditions on Earth, some verifiable to over 10,000 years. Songlines describe coastal features now underwater. Specific stories tell of places where one could walk to islands that now require boats, of bays that were once valleys. Geologists have tested these claims against sea level data and found matches. Rottnest Island, off Western Australia, was connected to mainland until 700 years ago. Aboriginal tradition says exactly this. The stories are not metaphor. They are map, history, and witness compressed into song and repeated precisely enough to survive 150 generations. They watched the waters rise, and they remembered. They watched the stars and knew, but they also watched the water. Coastal peoples are by necessity observers of tide and season and the slow encroachment that in a lifetime moves the shore. But certain events would not be slow. When ice dams broke, meltwater pulses could raise sea level by meters in years. Tsunami generated by underwater landslides, made more likely as continental shelves adjusted to changing weight of water and ice, could devastate coasts in hours. Gradual drowning punctuated by catastrophic surges, that is what geology describes. 40 days of rain is mythic compression. 40 generations of rising water with occasional terrifying accelerations, that is what actually happened. Both are flood. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis proposes a specific catastrophic event. Around 5600 BCE, as Mediterranean waters rose, they breached the Bosphorus and flooded into the Black Sea basin, which had been a lower freshwater lake. The inflow was immense, 10 cubic miles of water per day, raising the lake level rapidly and drowning settlements around its shore. Underwater archaeology has found structures beneath the Black Sea at the depth predicted by the hypothesis. Critics debate the timeline and mechanism, but the flooding itself is undisputed. If this happened, survivors fleeing in all directions would carry the story. To the south, it might reach Mesopotamia and become the Genesis account. To the north, it might seed Indo-European flood myths. Every inhabited continent has flood stories. The Americas, isolated from Old World for 12,000 years, developed independent accounts. Hopi tradition speaks of a previous world destroyed by water. Aztec myth describes ages of creation, each ending in catastrophe, one by flood. Inca legends tell of Viracocha saving humanity after deluge. The Ojibwe remember Nanabozo rebuilding Earth after water covered everything. These cannot be borrowings. They are either universal human imagination projecting the same fear, or universal human memory recording similar experiences. Given that all continents did experience coastal drowning as Ice Age ended, and that humans everywhere lived near water because water is life, memory seems more plausible than coincidence. The emotional weight matters as much as the geology. Imagine watching the place where your ancestors are buried disappear underwater. Imagine the shore where your children played becoming uninhabitable. Imagine knowing, generation after generation, that the world is shrinking, that the sea is taking everything, that soon there will be nowhere left unless you flee inland to unknown territories and uncertain welcome. That psychological experience of slow catastrophe would scar cultural memory forever. The flood myths are not dry recitations of sea level rise. They are trauma narratives, the processing of loss so profound that it required theological explanation. The waters rose. The world ended. Somebody saved us. That is how we are here. The waters rose and knowledge became portable. What cannot be carried must be left. Stone structures too massive to move might be built as markers, encoded with information for those who come after. Lightweight valuables, seeds and star charts and metallurgy secrets would be priority cargo. The necessity of selectivity would focus preservation effort on what matters most. This is why every flood myth emphasizes the Ark's cargo. Not just survival of biology but salvation of civilization. Noah takes animals in pairs but also the knowledge to steward them. Ziusadra saves seed of all living things but also the wisdom of agriculture. The vessel is not just refuge. It is library, archive, university, compressed into whatever craft can float. The waters rose, and the watching continued. Even in displacement, even in trauma, the watchers kept watching. Refugees from drowned coasts arrived at highlands and river valleys with portable observatories in their memory, star positions and seasonal markers they could reestablish anywhere. The knowledge survived because it was prioritized, because someone decided that knowing when to plant and how to navigate mattered more than personal comfort. This is the generosity encoded in the Watcher myth. Whether divine or human, they gave away what they knew. They taught the traumatized survivors not just to survive but to rebuild. And when we look at Göbekli Tepe or Eridu, we see success. They watched, they saved, they taught, and civilization continued. Nippur was never a political capital, never the seat of empire, yet every Sumerian king sought legitimacy there. It stood as religious center, the place where gods gathered in council, where the tablets of destiny were kept. Those tablets, mythologically speaking, held the fate of the world, the divine decrees that ordered reality. Archaeologically speaking, Nippur's temple libraries held the master copies of sacred texts, the canonical versions against which all others were checked. To control Nippur was not to rule Mesopotamia but to define its story. And the story Nippur told, insistently and repeatedly, was that humanity existed before the flood and carried something essential through it. The Sumerian king list, found in multiple copies but with Nippur origin, divides history with precision. Before the flood, 8 kings in 5 cities reigned for a total of 241,200 years. Then comes the line, translated with various nuance, the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, but the reign lengths become plausible. Decades and centuries rather than millennia. Scholars call the early numbers symbolic, representing dynasties rather than individuals, or mythic rather than historical. But the text itself treats the division as absolute. Something happened. Something changed. The flood marks a boundary between what came before and what came after, between deep past and remembered history. The Anunnaki Council appears repeatedly in texts from Nippur. These are the great gods, offspring of En and Ki, heaven and earth, numbering 7 or sometimes 12, judging the fates of mortals and gods alike. Enlil, storm god and chief of the council, held the tablets of destiny. Enki, god of wisdom and water, served as counselor. Inanna, goddess of love and war, disrupted divine plans. Nergal ruled the underworld. Each god held specific portfolio: agriculture, writing, warfare, justice. The texts present them as powerful yet limited, immortal yet emotional, transcendent yet involved. They are not allegorical. They are treated as active agents in history, as real as any king. The flood decision, in Nippur's version, comes from the council. Humanity has become too numerous, too loud. Enlil cannot sleep for the noise. He proposes annihilation. Enki objects but is outvoted. The decree is issued. The flood will cleanse the earth. This is not arbitrary divine cruelty, but a decision made, debated, and executed by committee. Some texts suggest the real issue was not noise but knowledge, that humanity was approaching divine prerogatives, prompting jealous gods to intervene. Others hint that the flood was punishment for the Watcher transgression, the mingling of divine and human that produced the Nephilim. Either way, the council decided. Enki found a loophole. Ziusadra survived. After the flood, according to Nippur texts, something changed in the divine-human relationship. Before, gods and humans interacted directly. Kings were born of divine-human unions. Temples were meeting places. After a distance opened, gods became more remote. Human lifespan shortened. The direct access to divine knowledge ceased. Genesis chapter 6 captures this shift. My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Is this theological explanation for why we feel disconnected from our origins? Or does it encode the reality that direct transmission of pre-flood knowledge, whether from coastal sophisticates or astronomer priests, ended because the transmitters died or dispersed? Yet knowledge did persist at Nippur. The temple complex called Eker, House of the Mountain, contained libraries with thousands of tablets. Scribes copied astronomical tables, medical texts, mathematical problems, legal precedents, hymns, myths, king lists, all the accumulated learning of Mesopotamian civilization. When Babylon rose to dominance, its scholars came to Nippur to copy texts. When Assyria conquered the region, Ashurbanipal's librarians raided Nippur's archives. The knowledge encoded there was recognized as foundational, earlier, and more authoritative than any rival tradition. If pre-flood knowledge was preserved anywhere, Nippur would be the place. And Nippur's scribes, generation after generation, insisted, we remember what came before the waters. They watched the stars and knew. Nippur's astronomical texts record observations stretching back centuries before the texts themselves were written. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, found at Nippur and other sites, document the planet's appearances and disappearances over years, using them to predict omens and seasons. But the precision suggests the records originated much earlier, copied and passed down. Mathematical astronomy requires long-term observation. To know that Venus returns to the same sky position every 8 years requires at least 8 years of watching. To verify the pattern requires generations. The tablets present themselves as containing ancient knowledge, not recent discovery. The watching, they imply, began before the cities, perhaps before the flood. The myth of the tablets of destiny themselves is instructive. In various Mesopotamian texts, these tablets are stolen by monstrous Enzu, cosmic bird of storms, and must be recovered by a hero god. Whoever possesses the tablets controls fate, can speak the words that make things be. This is mythology, yet it encodes something real, the power of written records to shape reality. Nippur held the tablets, literally the clay archives that defined legitimate kingship, proper ritual, correct history. To control the narrative is to control destiny. The ancients understood this. The tablets of destiny are not magical. They are archival authority made mythological, the recognition that memory determines power. Nippur declined in the first millennium BCE but remained sacred. Even when abandoned politically, pilgrims came to its ruins. The site memory persisted. Arab geographers in medieval times knew it as Nufr, holy place. Modern excavations in the 1890s and continuing to present have recovered over 60,000 tablets and fragments from Nippur, the largest cuneiform archive ever found. Among them, the flood narratives, the king lists, the astronomical records, the hymns to Enlil. The continuity is staggering. For over 2,000 years, Nippur served as memory center. It preserved the story that humanity survived a flood and carried forward knowledge from before. Is that mythology or history? Nippur answers both, and it matters. Compare Nippur to Göbekli Tepe, separated by 1,500 miles and 5,000 years. Both are religious centers without being capitals. Both encode knowledge in durable form, clay tablets at one, stone pillars at the other. Both were intentionally preserved, Nippur through continuous copying, Göbekli through careful burial. The Younger Dryas separates them chronologically, the flood event in mythic time. Göbekli built just after the catastrophe, possibly as warning or memory. Nippur built millennia later, possibly as archive for survivors' testimony. Both respond to the same imperative. Catastrophe requires that knowledge be preserved in the most permanent form available. Memory must not fail again. The tablets of destiny, in the end, are not objects but commitment. The commitment to write down what matters, to copy it faithfully, to store it carefully, to teach the next generation to read and value it. Nippur exemplifies this commitment at civilizational scale. For 2 millennia, resources were invested in preservation. Scribes spent careers copying texts they might not fully understand, trusting that future generations would need them. This is the Watcher's gift in practical form. They watched, they recorded, they taught the importance of recording, and because they did, we can read Ziusadra's story in his own language, hear his warning across 5,000 years. The tablets remember, the stones remember, and now we can remember too. Nippur closes with a question that reaches forward to the present. What are we preserving? What will survive our own catastrophes? The Nippur scribes chose flood narratives, astronomical records, legal precedents, sacred hymns, the king list that shows where we came from. They made no archive of daily gossip, personal letters, commercial receipts, except insofar as those accidentally survived. They prioritized what mattered for continuity of civilization. If our world ended tomorrow, what would we want the survivors to know? The Watchers made that choice after the last great catastrophe. Nippur preserved their choice. Now the question returns, what are we watching and what will we save? The number 7 appears with suspicious frequency in ancient accounts of wisdom teachers. Mesopotamia speaks of 7 Apkallu, sages sent by Enki before the flood to teach civilization's arts. India honors 7 rishis, seers who preserved sacred knowledge through cosmic dissolutions. Plato references 7 Atlantean kings who held council. Indigenous traditions from North America to Oceania recount 7 culture heroes or ancestors. This is not chance. 7 signifies completeness, divine order, sacredness across cultures. But it also suggests structure, a council or school, knowledge distributed among specialists. Not one teacher but a system of teachers, each with specific expertise, working together to preserve and transmit what mattered most before the waters came. The Mesopotamian Apkallu are most explicitly described. Their name means great sage or wise one. They came from the Abzu, Enki's watery domain, before the flood. They appear in art as fishmen or human figures wearing fish cloaks, suggesting amphibious nature or coastal origin. Texts name them individually. Adapa, who accidentally refused the gift of immortality. Wana, also called Oans, who taught writing and city building. Each Apkallu served a particular king, established a particular city, introduced a particular art. After the flood, their direct presence ceased, but their teachings remained. Post-flood kings claimed Apkallu as ancestors or advisors, legitimizing rule through connection to pre-flood wisdom tradition. India's 7 rishis, Saptarishi, are similarly foundational. They survived the cosmic dissolution, pralaya, which Hindu cosmology describes as cyclical rather than singular. The rishis are mind-born sons of Brahma, appearing at the beginning of each cosmic cycle to restore the Vedas, the sacred knowledge. Their names Marichi, Atri, Angiras, Palasatya, Pulaha, Kratu, Vasishtha remain central to Hindu tradition. They are associated with the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, celestial markers guiding earthly wisdom. Like the Apkallu, they are teachers not rulers, transmitters not originators of knowledge. And like the flood survivors across cultures, they bridge the discontinuity, carrying forward what must not be lost when worlds end and begin again. Plato's Atlantis account, dismissed by many as allegory, describes 7 kings of concentric ringed city. Atlantis, he says, was destroyed by earthquakes and floods for its hubris, sinking into the Atlantic Ocean in a single day and night. The story frustrates because Plato treats it as history told to Solon by Egyptian priests who claim it happened 9,000 years before, around 9,600 BCE. That date is precisely the Younger Dryas boundary. Coincidence? Plato's invention? Or Egyptian preservation of actual catastrophe memory? The seven kings, either way, represent ordered governance and knowledge stewardship that failed to prevent disaster. Their pattern matches the Apkallu and Rishis, seven who ruled or taught before the waters came. Oceanic traditions add weight to the pattern. Polynesian oral histories speak of seven canoes or seven founding ancestors making great voyages across the Pacific, carrying knowledge of navigation, agriculture, boat building. The Maori of New Zealand trace lineage to seven arrivals. Hawaiian tradition honors multiple founding voyager figures. Given the vast distances and precision required for Pacific navigation, the knowledge these voyagers carried, star paths, current patterns, seasonal winds, represents generations of accumulated observation. They are coastal peoples par excellence, whose world literally is ocean, and whose myths remember leaving homeland islands that sank or were abandoned. The seven carried what their drowned homelands knew across water to new lands. Indigenous North American traditions contribute complexity. The Hopi speak of worlds previous to this one, each destroyed when inhabitants forgot sacred teachings. Seven figures or clans often structure origin accounts. Navajo tradition describes emergence through worlds, guided by holy people who taught proper relationship with land and sky. Cherokee remember clans established by seven boys who became the Pleiades. Algonquian traditions honor culture heroes who taught essential skills after a cleansing flood. The recurrence of seven and of teaching after catastrophe mirrors old world patterns despite geographic isolation. Either humans everywhere imagine the same story structure, or these memories echo actual events when climate catastrophe displaced peoples globally and survivors consolidated transmitted knowledge in structured ways. They watched the stars and knew. The seven sages, whoever and wherever they were, are consistently associated with celestial knowledge. The Rishis become stars. The Cherokee boys become Pleiades. The Polynesian navigators sailed by stars. The Apkallu taught astronomy. The pattern suggests that star knowledge was the foundation of their authority and utility. Why? Because in the aftermath of catastrophe, when landmarks drown and territories shift, the stars remain constant. Navigation, calendars, seasonal marking, agricultural timing, all depend on celestial observation. A teacher who knows the stars can guide the lost, can tell when to plant in unfamiliar soil, can navigate to unseen destinations. Star knowledge is survival knowledge after the world drowns. The transition from direct presence to institutional memory occurs in every tradition. The Apkallu came before the flood, but post-flood kings only claim descent or connection. The Rishis restore the Vedas each cycle, but must do so through transmission to human priests. Atlantis sinks, its knowledge lost except what Egyptian priests preserve. Polynesian navigators land and teach, then become ancestors invoked but no longer present. The seven, across cultures, are described as more accessible in the deep past, gradually becoming more legendary as time passes. This could be simple myth decay, human teachers becoming divine in retelling. Or it could encode the reality that after the immediate crisis passed, direct oral transmission from survivors ended. Knowledge became institutional. Göbekli Tepe might represent such a transition point. Built immediately after the Younger Dryas by people who should be mobile hunter-gatherers, it shows organization and knowledge that implies teachers. The careful burial after centuries of use suggests intentional preservation. Were the builders the seven or students of the seven, encoding in stone what they had been taught? The simultaneous emergence of agriculture, the sudden appearance of complex society in multiple regions around 9000 BCE, all fit the pattern of knowledge distribution from survivors to locals. The seven are not one place but a system, teachers dispersing to where refugees gathered, establishing schools or priesthoods, ensuring the knowledge would not die when they did. The commonalities overwhelm the differences. Teacher figures associated with water, whether Apkallu from the Abzu, Viracocha walking on water, Polynesian voyagers crossing oceans, or flood survivors arriving by boat. Knowledge of stars as primary gift. agriculture, writing, architecture, medicine as secondary transmissions. Appearance after catastrophe, often explicitly after flood. Gradual withdrawal or transformation into legendary status. And the number 7, signifying completeness, distributed expertise, council rather than hierarchy. These are not vague similarities. They are specific shared structure across isolated cultures. Coincidence strains credulity. Universal archetype is possible. Or, the alternative, these myths preserve memory of a real period when displaced survivors of climate catastrophe systematically transmitted survival knowledge to multiple refuge populations. If the 7 were real in whatever form, their achievement staggers. They faced a drowned world, displaced populations, destroyed knowledge systems, and they organized preservation. They identified what mattered: stars, seeds, metalworking, healing, record-keeping. They taught across cultural and linguistic barriers. They established institutions, priesthoods, and scribal schools to continue transmission after they died. They encoded knowledge in stone and tablet and song. And they succeeded. 10,000 years later, we still use astronomy they systematized, grow crops they taught to domesticate, work metals they introduced, write in systems descended from theirs. The 7 watched, taught, and gifted continuity. Whether divine or human, their legacy is civilization itself. 7 is the number of completeness and renewal. 7 days in the week, 7 classical planets, 7 notes in the scale, 7 colors in the rainbow. The 7 sages embody the human need to structure knowledge for survival. They watched the stars and knew catastrophe was coming or had come. They carried forward what must not be lost. Their names and faces differ across oceans and millennia, but their function is identical. Bridge the discontinuity, preserve the essential, teach the next generation. Every culture that survives catastrophe creates its 7, whether literally or structurally. The question we face is, who are our 7, and what are we teaching them to save? Stone remembers what flesh forgets. A human lifetime passes, memory fades, oral tradition drifts, but stone endures. The megalithic impulse, the drive to carve and arrange massive stones, emerges globally after the Younger Dryas. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 9,600 BCE. Poverty Point in Louisiana, 1700 BCE. Karnak in France, 4500 BCE. Stonehenge in Britain, 3000 BCE. Tiwanaku in Bolivia, 1500 BCE. Nan Madol in Micronesia, 1100 CE. These are not primitive cultures building randomly. These are sophisticated societies investing enormous resources in permanent statements. The question is, what were they trying to preserve? What knowledge did they fear would be lost without encoding in the most durable medium available? Göbekli Tepe demands attention. Built by hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked agriculture, cities, writing, or specialized labor, it should not exist. Yet there it stands or stood before intentional burial. Massive T-shaped pillars weighing tons, carved with foxes, snakes, wild boars, scorpions, vultures, arranged in circular enclosures. The skill required suggests specialist stonemasons. The organization suggests leadership capable of coordinating labor without writing. The location, on a hill visible for miles, suggests intentional visibility, a marker or beacon. And the timing, built immediately after the Younger Dryas temperature spike, suggests response to trauma. When the world nearly ended, survivors built something that would remember. Pillar 43, the vulture stone, may encode specific information. Researchers interpreting the carved animals as constellation positions argue it depicts the sky around 10,950 BCE, the moment a comet impact triggered the Younger Dryas. A headless human figure appears, perhaps symbolizing catastrophic death. The arrangement they propose is both star map and warning. This came from the sky, it can happen again, watch the stars. Critics argue the interpretation is speculative, seeing patterns in ambiguous carvings. But even critics acknowledge the pillars encode something deliberate. Whether astronomical event or mythological narrative or both, Göbekli intentionally preserved information in stone, expecting someone someday would need to read and understand. The intentional burial of Göbekli adds to the mystery. Around 8000 BCE, after perhaps 1500 years of use, the site was carefully filled with rubble, the pillars preserved but hidden. This was not abandonment or destruction. Archaeological evidence shows deliberate, respectful burial. Why? One theory: the knowledge had been successfully transmitted to the next phase of civilization. The temple served its purpose as school or archive, and once agriculture and permanent settlements emerged, the stone library could be closed. Another theory: the site had to be sealed, knowledge preserved but controlled, dangerous information protected from those not ready to understand. Either way, burial was preservation, not erasure. Stonehenge, for 1,000 years newer than Göbekli, shows sophisticated astronomical alignment. The heel stone marks summer solstice sunrise. Other alignments track lunar cycles and possibly eclipses. Recent analysis suggests the site may have functioned as calendar, tracking seasons for agricultural timing. But the stones themselves, some transported from Wales 200 miles distant, represent immense investment. Why bring specific rocks such distance? Perhaps the stone type mattered, specific geology for specific purpose. Or perhaps the act of transport itself was ritual, connecting distant places through shared effort. Either way, Stonehenge encodes knowledge in arrangement and orientation. The stones remember where the sun rises, where the moon turns. They teach time. They watched the stars and knew the stones would outlast them. Across continents, megalith builders aligned structures to celestial events. Newgrange in Ireland, sunlight penetrates inner chamber only at winter solstice. Karnak in Egypt, main axis aligns to summer solstice sunset. Mayan pyramids at Chichen Itza create shadow serpents at equinoxes. Chanquillo in Peru, 13 towers mark solar year. Maeshowe in Scotland, winter solstice alignment. The pattern is universal. When humans build in stone, they build with the sky. This is not worship or not only worship. It is preservation of astronomical knowledge, encoding in architecture what must be known to survive. When seasons turn, when time cycles, where we are in the cosmos. Poverty Point in Louisiana presents American complexity. Built by indigenous peoples around 1700 BCE, it features massive earthwork ridges arranged in concentric semicircles, with stone plaza and objects traded from hundreds of miles. This is sophisticated society in North America 2,000 years before Christ, challenging assumptions about New World development. The site shows planning, resources, organization, long-distance trade networks. But what was being preserved? The mounds and ridges align to celestial events. The central plaza may have served astronomical observation or ritual. Whatever its function, Poverty Point demonstrates that North Americans independently developed the same impulse. When knowledge matters, encode it in the earth and stone. Build it so large it cannot be forgotten. Tiwanaku's Gateway of the Sun demonstrates another preservation strategy. This massive stone lintel, carved from single andesite block weighing tons, depicts central figures surrounded by calendar markings representing solar year, lunar cycles, possibly Venus positions. The precision of astronomical calculation encoded in stone form is remarkable. Andean cultures, lacking writing as we define it, encoded information in textiles, quipus, and stone monuments. The gateway is not decorative arch. It is reference work, permanent calendar accessible to anyone who learned the symbolic system. When the society that built it collapsed, the knowledge remained, encoded in stone, waiting for archaeologists to decipher and indigenous descendants to reclaim. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, adds complexity and warning. The famous Moai statues, massive carved figures facing inland, were erected over centuries by Polynesian culture. The stones remember ancestors, chiefs, gods, The purpose debated but the effort undeniable. Yet Easter Island also remembers ecological collapse. The island was once forested. Stone statue transport required trees for rollers and rope. As forests were cut, resources dwindled. Society collapsed into warfare. When Europeans arrived, the population was fraction of its peak. The Moai toppled. The stones intended to preserve memory became monuments to hubris. Not all stone memory is success story. Sometimes the stones remember what we destroyed in the act of building permanence. Nan Madol, stone city built on artificial islands off Micronesia, demonstrates Pacific sophistication. Constructed between 1100 and 1600 CE, it features walls built from massive basalt columns, creating ceremonial and residential spaces on coral reef platforms. The engineering and labor required are formidable, moving basalt from quarries, constructing islands, raising walls. Oral tradition says the stones flew into place by magic, which archaeologists translate as we do not fully understand the techniques used. Like Tiwanaku, like Easter Island, Nan Madol shows oceanic peoples building permanent stone memory in environments where stone is precious and labor-intensive. The pattern holds globally. Important knowledge gets encoded in the most durable medium available, regardless of cost. The stones remember what we choose to carve. Göbekli Tepe carved animals and possibly stars. Stonehenge arranged stones to track sun and moon. The gateway of the sun carved calendars. Easter Island carved ancestors. Every choice reflects values. What must not be forgotten? For post-catastrophe societies, astronomical knowledge topped the list. For stable societies, lineages and laws. But the act of carving, the commitment to permanence, transcends content. It says, "This matters so much we will invest years, generations even, to encode it in stone." The Watchers taught, and among their gifts was the concept of permanent record. Writing preserves words. Stone preserves presence. Both say to the future, we were here, we knew, remember. The chapter closes at Göbekli Tepe, where it began, but with different question. The stones remember, yes, but do we? The site lay buried for 11,000 years. The stones waited, encoded message intact. When excavations began in 1995, the message started being read again. But how much other stone memory lies unread? How many coastal megaliths drowned when seas rose? How many sites remain buried or unrecognized? The stones remember perfectly. They wait with infinite patience. The failure is ours when we forget to look, forget to read, forget that our ancestors had urgent knowledge to preserve. They watched the stars, carved the stones, and trusted we would eventually understand. Are we listening? High in the Andes, where altitude steals breath and crops struggle to grow, stone ruins defy expectation. Tiwanaku sits at 12,800 feet, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, straddling Bolivia and Peru. Massive blocks fitted with precision rival Giza. The gateway of the sun weighs tons yet balances on delicate carving. H-shaped blocks interlock without mortar, earthquake-resistant for over a millennium. This is not primitive construction. This is engineering sophistication at the edge of what Earth supports. And the legends say it came suddenly, taught by strangers who arrived after a great flood destroyed the previous world. They came from the water, they taught, they vanished. The pattern repeats again. Viracocha, the teacher, dominates Andean origin myths. After the flood destroyed the previous world, he emerged from Lake Titicaca or came across its waters. He was tall, bearded, light-skinned according to later Spanish chroniclers recording indigenous testimony. He traveled through the land creating people, teaching agriculture, architecture, astronomy, healing. He ordered the sun and moon to rise from islands in the lake. He established proper worship and social order. His name means sea foam or fat of the sea, suggesting water origin. When his teaching was complete, he walked across the Pacific and disappeared, promising to return. The Spanish arrived with beards and ships. Some indigenous peoples wondered if Viracocha had come back. The chronology troubles. Tiwanaku's origins reach back to 1500 BCE, flourished around 500 to 900 CE, then collapsed. But local legends claim the site was built in a single night by giants or gods before humans lived there. Aymara tradition insists Tiwanaku existed before the flood, was destroyed, then rebuilt by Viracocha's teaching. Archaeology finds no pre-flood layers, but archaeology can only find what survives. If earlier construction was destroyed and cleared before rebuilding, traces would be minimal. Or the legends compress time, mythologizing multiple building phases into single supernatural event. Either way, the tradition insists knowledge here came from before, carried through catastrophe, applied after. The builders were students, not inventors. The precision of stonework suggests sophisticated tools and knowledge. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons fit so tightly a knife blade cannot enter the joints. Surfaces show drill marks, saw cuts, right angles. The Pumapunku complex nearby features H-blocks with complex interlocking geometry, standardized measurements, modular design. This is not trial and error stonework. This is planned engineering with quality control. Yet the Inca, who inherited and revered these sites, claimed they did not build them, that they were already ancient when the Inca arrived. The tradition distinguishes between those who knew how and those who maintained. Tiwanaku's builders had knowledge the later inheritors only partially retained. Where did the knowledge originate? They watched the stars and knew. Tiwanaku's layout aligns to celestial events. The Kalasasaya platform marks solstices and equinoxes with stone pillars. The gateway of the sun may function as calendar, its carvings representing solar year, possibly Venus cycles. The site's construction required astronomical knowledge for orientation and timing of agricultural cycles at extreme altitude. Some researchers propose Tiwanaku was built when certain stars aligned differently, suggesting greater age than orthodox chronology allows. Others see the alignments as functional necessity. Any agricultural society at this altitude must track seasons precisely or starve. Either way, star knowledge was foundational. The builders watched the sky and encoded its patterns in stone and structure. The flood narrative permeates Andean tradition. Before this world, previous worlds existed and were destroyed. The Inca recorded these as ages or suns, each ending in catastrophe. The age before ours ended in water. Viracocha appeared after the waters receded, found the world empty or populated by survivors who had forgotten civilization, and taught them to begin again. The similarity to Mesopotamian narratives is striking. Different ocean, different mountain refuge, Lake Titicaca not Ararat, Viracocha not Noah, but the same structure. Flood destroys, teacher survives or arrives, knowledge is transmitted, civilization resumes. Either this is universal human imagination, or it is universal human memory of when the world actually drowned and teachers actually came. The bearded stranger detail complicates interpretation. Spanish chroniclers, recording testimonies decades after conquest, note repeatedly that Viracocha and other Andean teacher figures were described as bearded and light-skinned. Indigenous Andean peoples generally lack heavy facial hair. Some interpret this as evidence of transoceanic contact, visitors from Mediterranean or other bearded cultures. Others suggest the descriptions are post-conquest contamination, indigenous peoples telling Spanish what they wanted to hear, or Spanish misrecording or inventing details. Still others propose the beard is symbolic, representing wisdom or age, not literal description. The mystery remains, but the pattern holds. Teacher comes from elsewhere, looks different, possesses superior knowledge, transforms the local culture, then departs. Why is this story told worldwide? Compare Viracocha to Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica. Both are bearded culture heroes appearing after catastrophe. Both teach agriculture, architecture, astronomy, writing, or record-keeping. Both are associated with Venus, the morning star. Both depart across water promising return. The cultures were not in contact. separated by jungle and mountain and 2,000 miles. Yet the stories match in structure and detail. Add Egypt's Thoth, Mesopotamia's Enki, India's Narada, each a wisdom teacher traveling, instructing, departing. The global pattern of itinerant teachers suggests either archetypal story humans everywhere create, or historical reality, actual knowledge bearers traveling after the younger Dryas dispersing survival information to scattered refuge populations. Both explanations challenge comfortable assumptions. Tiwanaku collapsed around 1000 CE. Theories include drought, climate shift, social upheaval, the usual suspects when cities fail. The sophisticated knowledge of architecture, astronomy, agriculture did not entirely disappear. The Inca absorbed some, local Aymara communities preserved others. But the full system, whatever allowed Tiwanaku to thrive at impossible altitude, was lost. Later peoples revered the ruins but could not replicate them. The gateway of the sun was found toppled. Pumapunka's blocks scattered as though by earthquake. Knowledge fragmented. This is the pattern's dark side. Teaching can be lost, must be continuously maintained, requires institutions and commitment. If transmission breaks, even stone memories become unreadable puzzles. Watching must continue every generation or the knowledge dies. The promise of return haunts many traditions. Viracocha would return. Quetzalcoatl would return. The legends became prophecy, and prophecy became tragedy when Spanish arrived with ships and beards. The misidentification was catastrophic. But the promise itself is interesting. Why would teaching figures promise return? Perhaps it encodes the understanding that knowledge transmission is ongoing, not one-time event. Teachers leave when immediate crisis passes, but civilizations will face new challenges requiring new teaching. The promise of return is the promise that knowledge is available, that teachers will come when needed, that humanity is not alone in the cosmos or history. Whether the teachers are divine, human survivors, or internal human capacity for innovation, the promise is, you will be taught again when you need it. They watched the stars and knew that teaching must be encoded in multiple forms. Tiwanaku used stone monuments, calendar gates, architectural alignments, all readable by those trained to see. They likely used textiles, quipus, oral traditions, perishable media that did not survive. Redundancy ensures transmission. If one medium fails, others preserve the core. This is sophisticated information theory applied before information theory existed. The Watchers, whoever they were, understood that knowledge is fragile. Stone encodes permanence but requires interpretation. Oral tradition adapts but drifts. Writing preserves specifics but needs literacy. Multiple encoding strategies, that is the true gift. Teaching future generations to use every available medium to remember what matters. Tiwanaku stands ruined but not silent. Its stones still teach those who learn to read them. The gateway of the sun still marks the year. The alignments still point to sky. Local Aymara communities still farm the terraces using techniques passed down across discontinuity. The knowledge fragmented but did not die. It persists in practice, in landscape, in stone. This is the Watcher's success and limitation both. They taught, they built, they preserved. Much survived, but much was lost. The chapter closes with recognition. Every generation is responsible for watching, learning, teaching, preserving. The bearded strangers taught Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku teaches us. Are we paying attention? Are we preparing to teach the next world when this one changes again? The stars do not forget. Continents shift, seas rise, civilizations fall, but Orion still hunts across winter sky. Sirius still rises brilliant before dawn. The Pleiades still mark the seasons. Ancient peoples knew this constancy in a world of change. Every culture that left records attended to the stars, not as decoration, not as superstition, but as the one reliable reference when everything else failed. The stars witnessed the flood, the catastrophe, the end of the old world. And the stars taught survivors how to orient, navigate, plant, and measure time in the New World. They are the ultimate witnesses, speaking a language that transcends culture and catastrophe, teaching anyone who learns to look up. Sirius, the dog star, dominates ancient attention. Brightest star in the night sky, its heliacal rising, when it first becomes visible before dawn, marked critical events. In Egypt, Sirius rising coincided with Nile flooding, the inundation that made agriculture possible. The Egyptian calendar was based on this event. The star was associated with Isis, goddess of magic and resurrection. In Mesopotamia, Sirius marked summer heat. The Greeks knew it brought dog days, oppressive weather. Polynesian navigators used Sirius as key reference point for ocean voyages. The Dogon people of Mali possess astronomical knowledge of Sirius that puzzles researchers, including its binary companion not visible without telescopes. The star connects cultures across oceans and centuries. The Pleiades cluster, seven sisters in Greek myth, appears in nearly every ancient tradition. The Pleiades rising marks planting season in Mediterranean. The Maori call them Matariki. Their appearance signals new year and planting time. Cherokee tradition places 7 boys ascending to become the cluster. The Aztec calendar was adjusted to Pleiades cycles. Japanese farmers planted by Subaru, their name for the cluster. Aboriginal Australians tracked Pleiades for seasonal resource gathering. 7 stars, visible to most people, bright enough to notice, clustered tight enough to be distinctive. They become universal calendar marker. Whether culture called them 7 sisters, 7 boys, or simply the cluster, they watched them to know when seasons turned. The Pleiades taught time to everyone. They watched the stars and knew that patterns repeat. The Saros cycle, eclipse prediction spanning 18 years, was known to Babylonians. The Metonic cycle, 19-year pattern reconciling lunar and solar calendars, was used by Greeks and Chinese. The precession of equinoxes, the slow wobble taking 26,000 years to complete, was detected by ancient astronomers despite requiring centuries of observation. These are not simple patterns. These are sophisticated mathematical recognitions requiring systematic record-keeping across generations. The knowledge implies institutions dedicated to observation, valuing long-term data, prioritizing cosmic understanding. It implies cultural continuity, scribal schools, and commitment to knowledge for its own sake. Or it implies inheritance from those who had already done the watching before the flood. Orion appears in every literate ancient culture. Egypt aligned pyramids to Orion's belt. The Babylonians called it the true shepherd of Anu. The Greeks saw the hunter. The Maya associated it with creation hearth. The Hopi linked it to ancestral emergence. The pattern is too consistent for coincidence. Orion dominates the winter sky, unmistakable and beautiful. But why do so many cultures associate it with creation, origins, gods, and ancestors? Perhaps because Orion rises in the east, symbolic direction of beginning. Perhaps because its visibility marks critical seasons for agriculture or hunting. Or perhaps because someone, before the cultures diverged, taught that Orion was important, and every descendant culture remembered without remembering why. The younger Dryas boundary shows possible cosmic trigger. The platinum layer, nanodiamonds, carbon spherules, and shocked quartz found globally at 10,800 BCE suggest extraterrestrial impact, likely comet fragments hitting the Laurentide ice sheet. The evidence is debated, but some researchers argue multiple impacts triggered rapid cooling, massive meltwater release, and species extinctions. If true, the catastrophe came from the sky. Survivors would have seen it, meteors streaking, impacts flashing, sky ablaze. They would know, viscerally, that heaven can destroy Earth. The obsession with watching stars, tracking comet paths, recording unusual celestial events, it might originate here. The memory that danger comes from above, that the sky must be watched always because it can kill. Indigenous flood myths frequently link celestial events to catastrophe. The Cherokee say the Pleiades are 7 boys who danced too long and ascended to the stars, and afterward the flood came. The Aztec belief system describes ages ending in various catastrophes, some cosmic. The Hopi describe fire from sky and subsequent destruction. The Australian Aboriginal traditions linking flood with celestial disturbances. These are not scientific accounts, but they consistently associate sky events with Earth disasters. Modern skeptics dismiss this as primitive causation error, seeing patterns where none exist. But if the Younger Dryas was triggered by impact, the associations are not error. They are witness testimony, preserved in the only language available. Myth, connecting what they saw in heaven with what happened on Earth. They watched the stars and knew the sky could change. Novae, supernovae, comets, all break the pattern of stellar constancy. The Chinese recorded supernovae, guest stars appearing then fading. Every culture tracked comets with mixture of awe and dread. If the stars are constant, then change in the stars signals importance. A new bright light, a wandering visitor. These break the rule and demand attention. Halley's Comet returns every 76 years, visible to naked eye. How many ancient civilizations watched it, recorded it, wondered at it? The Bayeux Tapestry shows Comet in 1066 CE as omen before Norman conquest. Comets meant change, often disaster. The stars witnessed, but comets warned. And after the flood, people watched for warnings. The zodiac, division of ecliptic into 12 constellations, appears in Babylon and spreads globally. The 12 signs, their associations with animals and concepts, become embedded in multiple cultures. This is not astronomy but cultural transmission. The specific divisions, the names, the symbolic meanings, these are not natural or inevitable. They are taught, learned, spread. The zodiac's wide distribution suggests either remarkable independent invention or, more likely, common origin. Perhaps pre-flood, perhaps early post-flood dispersion. The zodiac is not just stars. It is organized star knowledge, a system for teaching celestial positions, seasonal timing, navigational reference. It is curriculum, and curriculum implies teachers deciding what must be known, standardizing the knowing, ensuring transmission. The Watchers taught the zodiac. Precession awareness troubles mainstream chronology. The slow wobble of Earth's axis causes the position of stars to shift over 26,000 years. Currently, Polaris marks north. In 5,000 years, Vega will be the North Star. Ancient Egypt's pyramids aligned to Thuban, which was North Star when they were built. Detecting precession requires comparing observations across many centuries. Yet Hipparchus in Greece around 130 BCE is credited with discovery. But earlier hints appear in Mesopotamian texts, possibly Indian astronomy, maybe Egyptian priest knowledge. Some researchers argue precession knowledge implies great antiquity, observation programs stretching back before known civilization. If the Watchers tracked stars for generations before the flood, they would have noticed. They could have taught precession as proof that long-term observation reveals deep patterns. Stars as witnesses serve another function. They make knowledge testable. If you teach that Sirius rises before the flood comes, and it does, the student trusts the teacher. If you teach that Pleiades rising means plant now, and crops grow, the system is validated. Star knowledge is publicly verifiable, not requiring faith but observation. This makes it ideal foundation for teaching after catastrophe. The survivors or refugees can prove they know real things, not just claiming authority but demonstrating it. The stars witness and validate. They testify that the teachers teach truth. And once trust is established through stars, the students might believe the other teachings. Agriculture, metallurgy, social organization. The sky makes credible those who read it. The stars close the chapter where it began, in constancy. Everything else changed. Coasts drowned, climates shifted, societies collapsed, languages diverged. But Orion still hunts, Sirius still shines, the Pleiades still cluster. The stars neither lie nor forget. They watched the world drown. They watched the teachers teach. They watch us now, offering the same lessons our ancestors learned. Patient observation reveals patterns. Patterns allow prediction. Prediction enables survival. The watchers watched the stars and knew. They taught others to watch. The teaching continues, encoded in constellation names, zodiac divisions, astronomical records spanning millennia. The stars witnessed everything. They still testify. The question is, are we still listening? The ark is symbol, but symbols encode reality. Every flood myth emphasizes what was carried through catastrophe. Not just biological survival, though that matters, but preservation of knowledge, tools, seeds, animals, records. The emphasis reveals priorities. What must not be lost? Genesis says Noah took animals in pairs, ensuring genetic diversity, and implicitly his family's accumulated knowledge. The Sumerian account emphasizes seeds and craft knowledge. Enochian tradition stresses written records, secrets sealed for future revelation. The pattern across cultures is consistent. The saved include living things and knowing things. Survival is not merely physical continuation, but cultural and intellectual transmission. What good is surviving if you forget everything that makes life worth living, everything that separates subsistence from civilization? Seeds are life delayed, potential wrapped in protective coat. Every agricultural society treasures seed stores above gold. A bad harvest can be survived if next year's seed is protected. But lose the seed and famine becomes extinction. The flood myths always mention seeds explicitly. Ziusudra saves seed of all living things. Noah's sons will plant again. Viracocha teaches seed selection and storage. The emphasis is agricultural but also metaphorical. Seeds are knowledge waiting to germinate. A seed catalog is a library. Knowing which seeds thrive in which conditions is the accumulated experiment of centuries. Save the seeds, save the knowledge. Lose the seeds, even survival becomes subsistence. Without agriculture, there is no surplus. Without surplus, there is no civilization. Animals present genetic and practical challenge. Myths speak of pairs, preserving breeding populations. Modern conservation biology confirms this as real concern. Genetic bottlenecks cause extinction even when population survives temporarily. Did ancient peoples understand genetics? No, but they understood that inbreeding weakened stock, that diversity mattered, that you needed sufficient numbers to rebuild. So flood narratives emphasize saving multiple kinds, ensuring variety. But which animals are worth saving? The ones that feed you, clothe you, work for you. Sheep, goats, cattle, horses, dogs, fowl. These are domestic animals representing millennia of human effort to domesticate and breed. Saving them preserves not just species but human labor investment, the 10,000 years of selection that made wild aurochs into docile cattle. Tools and metallurgy represent compressed knowledge. A bronze sword is not merely metal-shaped. It is the knowledge of where tin and copper occur, how to mine them, what temperatures produce alloy, how to forge and temper. That knowledge took centuries to accumulate. Lose the tool, it can be replaced. Lose the knowledge of how to make the tool, you are back in the Stone Age literally. Flood narratives mention saving craft knowledge. The Apkallu taught metallurgy. Azazel taught sword-making. The emphasis on preserving technological knowledge makes practical sense. After catastrophe, survivors need tools. But more critically, they need the knowledge to make tools, to maintain and improve them. Technology without understanding is brittle. One generation's loss becomes permanent. They watched the stars and knew that navigation knowledge is survival. After flood, coastlines have changed, landmarks drowned, territories unfamiliar. But stars remain constant reference. The navigational techniques of Polynesians, dead reckoning by current and swell, star paths memorized, wind patterns known, represent sophisticated knowledge systems passed orally across generations. Without writing, this knowledge is embodied in practice and memory. Lose it and you are trapped on your island. Save it and the ocean becomes highway. The Watchers, if they were coastal peoples displaced by rising seas, would have brought navigation knowledge inland. To highlanders, it would seem magical. To fellow refugees, it would be essential. Star paths, current reading, boat building, these would be the curriculum. Knowledge that expands world. Medicine might be the most precious preservation. The knowledge of which plant heals which wound, which bark reduces fever, which combination cures infection, this cannot be quickly rediscovered. Trial and error produces more error than trial, more death than healing. The Watchers are credited with teaching herbalism and healing. This makes profound sense. After catastrophe, medicine becomes urgent. Injuries, exposure, disease from crowded refuge conditions, stress illnesses. Whoever has medical knowledge has power and gratitude. The plant pharmacopoeia of ancient cultures is vast and verifiable. Modern chemistry confirms many traditional remedies work. But accumulating that knowledge required countless generations of careful observation, experimentation, and record-keeping. Save the medical knowledge, save lives immediately. Lose it, relearning costs lives unnecessarily. Writing is power unprecedented. Oral tradition is powerful but limited by memory span and mutation across transmission. Written records are permanent, verifiable, and can hold complexity beyond memorization. The invention of writing around 3400 BCE in Mesopotamia is not just technology but revolution. Suddenly, knowledge can accumulate across generations without degradation. Complex mathematics, detailed laws, astronomical records, medical texts, all become possible. The earliest cuneiform tablets are not literature but economics. Temple inventories, trade records. But the technology, once invented, explodes into all domains. Writing preserves the flood narrative itself. Without writing, we would have oral traditions only dismissible as folklore. With cuneiform tablets, Genesis clay copies, we have textual witnesses claiming to preserve pre-flood memory. Architecture encodes knowledge in functional form. How to create shelter that stands, how to span distance with arch or beam, how to manage water with drains and cisterns, how to organize space for living, working, worshipping. The Watchers taught building. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates sophisticated architecture without cities. Someone knew how to quarry, transport, erect, carve massive stones before supposedly having practice. Either the practice was elsewhere, earlier, now lost, or the knowledge was taught by those who already knew. Post-flood settlements show sudden appearance of planned architecture. Right angles, standard measurements, drainage systems, foundations. These are not innovations discovered by experiment. These are applications of known principles. The saved knowledge included how to build enduringly and well. Social organization might be the subtlest preservation. How to govern without constant violence, how to distribute resources, how to organize labor for common projects, how to adjudicate disputes, these are not instinctive. They are learned. The earliest law codes, Uarnamu, Hammurabi, present themselves as divinely inspired but practically address specific social problems. Theft, assault, contract disputes, property rights. The codes are sophisticated with gradations of punishment, considerations of intent, protections for vulnerable. This legal thinking did not spring fully formed, but it appears very early in written record, suggesting oral tradition or taught principles predating writing. The Watchers brought not just tools but social tools, the knowledge of how to live together at scale. Without that, agriculture and technology are not enough. What was saved is what we have. Cities, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, law, these emerge around 3500 to 3000 BCE in the archaeological record, seemingly rapid compared to the millennia of hunter-gatherer existence before. Orthodox interpretation. Agriculture enabled surplus, enabled specialization, enabled complexity. But the package is so complete so quickly. Writing and cities and bronze and law all within centuries. Either humanity experienced extraordinary creative burst, or the knowledge base was not starting from zero. If the flood occurred around 9600 BCE and sophisticated coastal cultures were displaced, the gap is 6,000 years. How much knowledge could be preserved oral tradition across 200 generations? Enough, perhaps, to jumpstart rather than start civilization. The saved became the foundation. They watched the stars and saved what mattered most. Not luxuries but necessities. Seeds for planting, animals for labor, tools for working, knowledge for building, navigation for moving, medicine for healing, writing for remembering, law for organizing. The priorities reveal values. Practical survival first, then quality of life, then transmission to future. The ark is physical and metaphorical both. Carries biology and culture. Preserves genes and memes. The watchers, whoever they were, made choices about preservation. They could not save everything. They saved what would enable rebuilding. And because they chose well, because they prioritized generative knowledge, the seeds they saved grew into civilizations that eventually remembered the saving itself, encoded in myths of flood and ark. The chapter closes with ark landing, metaphorically. The waters recede. The saved disembark. The seeds are planted. The animals breed. The tools are used. The knowledge is taught. The watching continues. This is the moment every flood myth celebrates and every post-catastrophe society enacts. Emergence from survival mode into rebuilding mode. What was saved becomes what is. The foundation of the new world is the salvage of the old. The watchers watched, chose, saved, taught. Their success is measurable. We have cities, agriculture, writing, stars mapped, medicines that heal, laws that order because they saved what mattered. The question they passed to us: what are we saving? What will future catastrophe survivors need from us? Are we watching? We arrive at the end, which is also the beginning. The great flood story circles back to the question that opened this journey. Why do we tell this story? Every culture, every continent, the pattern repeats. Divine warning, catastrophic flood, chosen survivors, knowledge preserved, world reborn. We have traced it through Mesopotamian clay, Hebrew scripture, Enochian vision, Andean stone, Pacific song, indigenous testimony. We have examined the geology that confirms the flooding, the archaeology that shows sudden cultural complexity, the astronomy that suggests sophisticated observers, the monuments that encode warnings. What remains is interpretation. Was it myth or memory? The answer increasingly seems to be both, and that is precisely the point. Myths are not lies. They are compression, encoding, meaning-making wrapped around real experiences. The Younger Dryas was real. The sea level rise was real. Coastal cultures were displaced. Climate whiplashed. Megafauna died. Human populations bottlenecked. These are not theories but geological and archaeological facts. The survivors of that catastrophe would have needed to explain it, to make sense of horror, to teach descendants why the world changed. Myth is how humans process trauma and transmit survival knowledge. The gods decreed it, the stars warned it, the watchers taught us to survive it. These are not lies. They are true in a deeper way than literal, encoding both historical event and psychological response, both fact and meaning simultaneously. The watchers, in this reading, are neither entirely divine nor entirely human but something in between. The memory of real people who did real things, elevated and mythologized by grateful descendants. They watched the stars because survival required it. They taught because they had knowledge displaced populations needed. They warned because they had experienced catastrophe. They saved what mattered because they understood how fragile civilization is. Across generations of retelling, teacher becomes angel, refugee becomes God, organized preservation becomes divine plan. But underneath the mythological language, the historical skeleton remains. Some people knew more, taught others, ensured continuity. The names and specific divinity status, these may be mythologized. The function and achievement are real. They watched the stars and knew the pattern would repeat. Catastrophes cycle. Ice ages come and go. Climates shift. Impacts occur. Civilizations rise and fall. The obsessive preservation, the encoding in stone, the multiple redundant recording systems, these suggest the teachers understood that saving knowledge once was not enough. It must be saved repeatedly, taught continuously, encoded redundantly. Each generation must become watchers, must preserve for the next. The flood myths end not with survival but with teaching. Noah teaches his sons. Ziusadra's story is written down. Viracocha establishes order then departs. The 7 sages found institutions. The message is clear. You survived, now you must teach. The watching never ends. The next generation depends on your faithfulness. The stones remember. We have seen them. Göbekli Tepe's pillars waiting beneath Turkish soil for 11 millennia. Stonehenge marking solstices for 5,000 years. The gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku still teaching the year. Easter Island's Moai bearing witness to both achievement and hubris. These are not dead monuments but active teachers, speaking to anyone who learns their language. They remember what their builders knew, what they feared, what they hoped to preserve. Stone is patient. It waits for readers. The responsibility is ours. To read, to understand, to continue the preservation. The stones have done their part perfectly. They remember everything. The question is whether we remember to look, to learn, to become worthy students of ancient teachers. The waters rose, the world changed, but the story survived. That is the fundamental miracle. Against all odds, through catastrophe and cultural collapse, linguistic drift and geographic dispersion, the memory persisted. Sumerians told it. Hebrews preserved it. Greeks repeated it. Indians, Chinese, Mesoamericans, Andeans, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous Americans, Aboriginal Australians all told versions. The story itself is the arc, carrying across time the essential message. The world can end, knowledge can be lost, but if we watch, if we teach, if we preserve, continuity is possible. The flood narrative is not about the past alone. It is instruction manual for the present and future. We are the generation in the ark. What are we saving? They watched the stars and knew we would need to do the same. Modern catastrophe is not flood but climate change. Not sudden deluge but rising seas and shifting weather patterns. Not comet impact but human-caused warming. Yet the pattern is the same. Environmental catastrophe requiring displacement, knowledge preservation, cultural adaptation. The ancient warnings are newly relevant. Watch the signs. Preserve what matters. Teach the next generation. Organize for survival and continuity. The Watcher's curriculum remains valid. Astronomy to understand systems, agriculture for food security, technology for tools, medicine for health, social organization for cooperation, record-keeping for memory. We face a long emergency. The ancient responses are modern necessities. We must watch, preserve, teach. The cycle continues. Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried, preserved for the future. What are we burying? What are we preserving? The question is not rhetorical. Digital information is fragile, dependent on power and readers that may not survive collapse. We create vast amounts of data but preserve little intentionally. The ancients created less but preserved obsessively, in stone and clay, in song and structure. There is wisdom in their methods. In an age of information abundance, they teach scarcity thinking. Not everything can be saved, so choose wisely. In an age of digital ephemera, they teach permanence. What truly matters deserves durable medium. In an age of casual forgetting, they teach sacred memory. Some things must never be lost. The Watchers gave the gift of continuity. That is the synthesis. Not immortality, not utopia, not paradise, but continuity. The ability to survive catastrophe without becoming so impoverished that survival is meaningless. The preservation of enough knowledge, tools, seeds, animals, social structures, that the other side of disaster is not Stone Age but Bronze Age or Iron Age, that rebuilding is abbreviated, not starting from scratch. This is practical salvation. The flood myths are not about reward or punishment ultimately but about what it takes to continue, to maintain civilization's light when the waters rise? And they answer clearly. It takes watching, teaching, preserving, choosing wisely what to save, encoding redundantly, and above all, transmitting faithfully to the next generation. The memory endures because we choose to remember. This is the active verb. Memory is not passive inheritance but active maintenance. Every generation decides, do we preserve the story, teach the children, maintain the watch, or do we forget, dismiss as myth, prioritize comfort over continuity? The choice is always live, never settled. Nippur chose to preserve for 2 millennia. Göbekli Tepe chose to bury for future revelation. Easter Island chose glory over sustainability and paid the price. We are choosing now. The memory endures only if we endure it, carry it forward, teach it onward, live it faithfully. The watchers cannot force us to watch. They can only hope we choose to continue what they began. The Book of Enoch says the watchers taught secrets humans were not ready to know. Perhaps the real secret was not metallurgy or astronomy but this, that you are responsible. You cannot blame gods or fate. The knowledge exists. The catastrophes will come. Your choice is whether to watch, whether to prepare, whether to preserve, whether to teach. The ancient teachers gave not just information but obligation. With knowledge comes responsibility. They watched the stars, and having watched, they taught. They taught, and having taught, they tasked the students. You must watch now, you must teach next, you must preserve always. The secret is that salvation is human work, not divine intervention. We save ourselves by choosing to save what matters. The great flood story ends where it begins, with watching. The waters rose. The teachers taught. The knowledge survived. The story was told. And now the story reaches us, asking, what will you do? The watchers are not separate from us but within us. The human capacity to observe, remember, teach, preserve. Every teacher is a watcher. Every parent is an ark. Every student who learns and passes forward continues the chain. The story is not about ancient history alone, but about eternal pattern. Catastrophe comes. Knowledge is threatened. Some choose to watch, preserve, teach. Because they do, continuity is possible. Because they did, we exist. Because we might, others will. The memory endures. Watch the stars. Teach the children. Remember the flood. The cycle continues. The stones remember. The stars witness. The stories endure. We have traced the great flood through clay and scripture, through mountain temples and coastal drownings, through astronomical alignments and geological evidence. The watchers, whoever they were, divine or human or memory made mythological, gave the gift of continuity. They watched the stars and knew catastrophe was coming or had come. They preserved seeds and knowledge, tools and wisdom. They taught those who survived how to rebuild, not from scratch but from salvaged understanding. That is the message carved in every megalith, written in every flood narrative, sung in every oral tradition. We can survive the end of the world if we watch, if we preserve, if we teach. The question is not whether the story is true. The question is whether we will become the watchers our descendants will need. If this exploration has sparked something in you, like this video, if you want more journeys through the shadows between history and myth, subscribe to Whispered Empires. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, what time is it there, and what do you think we should be preserving for the future? The watching continues. The teaching continues. The memory endures through us. Watch the stars. Remember the flood. Teach what matters. Thank you for watching.